The grave on the right here is that of 37-year-old Jared Irwin. Sadly, the description is now worn off, but it says on his tombstone that he was killed in an engagement with the Indians at the Battle of Shepherd's Plantation on June 9th, 1836. And if you take a look on the left, you can see some of the makeup of the community that came out here to this part of West Georgia. You have the grave of Thomas Williams Sr., who was a part of the Georgia troops of the Revolutionary War. And what's so interesting about this is that Georgia never really fronted as many troops as other states, so a lot of them were given land grants in the deep interior around Columbus, which naturally caused a lot of animosity to develop between the Native Americans and these new white settlers. They were usually embraced pretty openly, but then in came the con men and the men who wanted to sell the land or claim they had right to it when they didn't, and conflict developed, which resulted in a couple of uprisings, the last of which had killed Jared Irwin. And here is his mother, whose grave has fallen over. She was born 1799, some of the earliest settlers in the area. And Jared Irwin being a 37-year-old kind of demonstrates the nature of the troops that were present at Shepherd's Plantation. Most of the main troops were up in Columbus or a little bit further south or north at Fort McCreary or Fort Jones, and the middle-aged militiamen, because back then 37 was practically, you got a couple feet in the grave there. That was an elderly man, and for him to be killed, it kind of shows that they were just giving farmers guns and telling them to post up at the plantation. Much like earlier conflicts with the Native Americans, the final Creek Uprising of 1836 was preceded by several months of random murders and bushwhacking in the backcountry, and by June 1836, most of the white homesteaders and settlers had decided to send their women and children up to Columbus, Georgia, where they could be guarded by the military proper, and in the meantime, they had established a number of blockhouses and provisional forts to guard the scattering of settlements along the Chattahoochee Valley and the people who decided to remain. And on June 9th, 1836, the most bold action took place in this war. See, it was the Creek Indians, but you also had the Yuchees and the Yuchees, who were led by a warrior named Jim Henry. And at this plantation, which had a fort named Fort McCreary a couple miles to the north and Fort Jones a few miles to the south, this was a very important plantation for the settlers, so you had a number of militiamen who had been based here under a man named Captain Garmony. Well, Garmony sent half of his men a few miles south to Fort Jones, and another number of men were out patrolling in the woods looking in the swamps. Well, Jim Henry, the Yuchee war chief, was watching and waiting for the perfect time. Well, now the fort here at Shepherd's Plantation is only at half strength, and a lot of men are out on patrol. So these men in the swamp are ambushed and killed, and the Indians begin firing off their guns, leading the captain to believe that their number is much greater and that the battle has already started in the swamp. In reality, it's a diversion, so Garmony gets his men together and does a charge on Jim Henry. Now, we don't know for certain if Jim Henry was involved, but all sources seem to indicate that this Yuchee chief was the main leader and that there were probably about 250 Native Americans lying in wait. And in the shadow of James Irwin's grave, behind all of these Confederate tombstones, you have the grave of the 77th Regiment Georgia Cavalry, Private James Leary, who was killed in 1836. I haven't been able to find much information about him, but this was the same year as the last Indian Uprising, and to be killed at such a young age, he was only 21, you can kind of tell that he was likely a casualty of Shepherd's Plantation, of which 22 names were recorded, but likely more died. And of course, as soon as the militia begins to charge into the swamp, they are surrounded and they have to fight a running retreat in which 22 of them at least are killed, and probably there are more, but we don't really know for certain. And this is a almost forgotten battle. It was one of the most bold actions to take place in the war, and what's so fascinating is that Jim Henry, after Indian relocation, he was sent to Indian Territory while a number of people who were involved with the rebellion were actually executed. He was sent to Indian Territory, and he would later fight decades later for the Confederacy because he felt that he had been wronged by the federal government here. And in the local cemeteries, you've got a couple graves of these early militiamen who had been killed. One from the 77th Cavalry, and one who was just a 37-year-old man who was killed defending this plantation. And the only reason the entire grouping of militiamen weren't killed in this battle is because the men that Captain Garbany had sent to Fort Jones returned upon hearing the rifle shots and provided reinforcements. Had this not happened, everybody might have been slaughtered by the forces of Jim Henry. Now, what I think is interesting about this as well is the fact that the Creek and Muskogee people had been kind of pacified by the War of 1813 and, of course, Andrew Jackson. Now, they had mostly taken up on the western side of the Chattahoochee, and they didn't necessarily, at least at the beginning, want to take part in this, although a couple of them, of course, were involved in the earlier murders and bushwhacking in the backcountry. However, once Jim Henry had kind of forced their hand by initiating this action, they would join in the war as well. Archibald Colquhoun Sr. was born in Scotland and died in the local area only a few years after the last uprising in 1836, and the Colquhoun family is kind of typical of a lot of the early pioneers in West Georgia who very likely participated in the Indian Wars and later settled the area on the land of the evicted Creek and Muskogee peoples, and you can see that his family has remained here for all of these years. I've met some of these folks who have been in the local area since the 1830s.